Coming up on the milk check.
The Red Sea seems to be an issue now as well.
Yeah, Josh, if the Houthis are getting involved, when you're looking at Yemen, that's a direct effect on the Red Sea, which is the other half of that peninsula. And then it starts to limit the only access point that you can have into the Red Sea being through the Suez Canal.
Welcome to the milk check from TC Jacoby and Company. I'm Josh White. Today is Thursday, June 23rd. In absence of our fearless leader, Ted, we invite our audience to join us for one of our bi-weekly commercial meetings where our group gets together and breaks down the market based on our individual disciplines. Today's group is a fairly large one, but we have members representing our fluid team, our ultra-filtrated and cream team, cheese, butterfat, milk powder, and whey, which makes up our trading group. We're in the dog days of summer right now. Schools are out. Families are traveling. There's people out of the office not making decisions. That's happening both in the US and in Europe. Let's touch on current market climate, what we're experiencing, and then what we're paying attention to or looking out for in 30 days' time. Let's start with where we're at on the milk side of things. Greg, both you and Jared have experienced a little turbulence over the past week or so with some milk movements. We're just coming out of a big heat stretch. We're on the cusp of the South starting to refill its bottling pipelines. What are you feeling and seeing right now, Greg?
We've had some plant closures that have pushed milk around the Mideast, the Northeast, and around the country. We have had a week or two of that. The first heat wave back several weeks ago hit the cows harder than expected. And I'm wondering if maybe that's the age of the herd is a little older, that maybe it hit them a little more. Usually we have a heat wave, the cows recover some. Normal summer, they get another heat wave, and then it hits them a little harder the second time or third time. Seems like the first heat wave hit the cows a little harder. I think production's down just a little bit more than we expected or earlier than maybe a normal summer. Other than plant problems that push milk around, it feels tight. We get to next month, schools start up again or are about to, and bottlers start putting milk into the bottle for schools. That it's going to get really tight and could be tight through September, October, and maybe production comes back a little bit and the pipeline gets filled and then it levels off demand a little bit. It feels tight other than plant closures. It's going to get really tight in a month. And we'll see where it goes. But production does seem like it was hit harder. I'm just wondering if maybe the age of the herd may have a little bit to do with it.
It was also pretty warm nights for the Midwest. It's pretty well documented that above 70s, tough on cows, below 70s allows them to recover nicely. I'm in Gurnee, Illinois, which is Grand Rapids latitude on the Michigan side. For us to get nights above 70 is rare, and we just went through a pretty good stretch where we had a lot of them. The entire Mideast and the Midwest, we went through a solid 4 or 5 days of pretty bad smoke. At least our area was bad enough that just walking outside to get your mail, you could taste it. So I can't imagine that helped anything.
How much it hurt is hard to quantify maybe, but definitely didn't help things.
Are we still really talking about two different countries, more or less? California, everything seems to be fine. They're running great. They're just pumping out milk. And then the rest of the country where it feels a little tighter.
That's the sense I get, everybody I talk to. Yes. You've got California on an island there, just filling up their plants, and everybody else in a tighter feel, all the way from the upper Midwest, Mideast, Northeast. And then, as you mentioned, I do think the pull to the Southeast will be starting fairly soon as their production slows. And by mid-August, when they're bottling for schools, it'll really get tight.
Europe is also talking about some of the same things. Heat sounds like it's impacted France the most. Germany's been pretty resilient. Everything I've read or heard is that in the recent weeks, people have taken their milk production forecast for the remainder of the year down in Europe, and by a noteworthy amount. To be clear, I think most expect European milk production for 2026 to be higher than it was in 2025. But it's been notably higher through June, and looking ahead for them to be taking those numbers down to modest growth means that they're expecting year over year numbers to be down in the second half of the year. So Europe seems to be slowing its rate of growth. Curious to what that means going into 2027. We seem to be making good milk and we've got plenty of ability to process it, but the rest of the world feels like it's starting to slow its growth rate and maybe start to slow down as we look ahead to 2027. Class 1 plants looking to start filling up a bit in the next 2 to 4 weeks. Jared, what's that mean for you and your team and your products?
Yeah, moving over to the condensed and fluid skim side, the market has become noticeably longer over the past couple of weeks. And the obvious driver there was the disruption that Fairlife experienced, which affected multiple plants across the country. With those plants still operating below full capacity following that cybersecurity event, milk that would have normally went into their UF and finished protein beverages has been redirected into balancing outlets, which in turn made condensed skim much more available. And that increased availability was real. We saw a lot more local offers as a result. As operations normalize and those plants continue to ramp up, I would expect some of that excess product to be reabsorbed, although the timing remains still uncertain. Condensed skim has been tight for much of the year. Obviously, that's been supported by the steady demand from both class 2 and 3. And the strong non-fat demand has also kept skim solids competitive. As those dryers continue to pull available skim away from the condensed markets, school milk will also begin here, as Greg alluded to, which should move more milk back into the bottling programs and further reduce the amount of condensed skim available for manufacturing for these Q4 months. Moving over to the UF side of things, that continues to have the strongest long-term demand story. We've touched on it on almost every podcast, but high protein dairy appears to have real staying power. Demand is coming from athletes, consumers focused on weight management, older adults trying to maintain muscle, and that's even beyond the folks using the GLP-1 medications who are told to prioritize protein. That demand also extends well beyond protein shakes. It's into yogurt, lactose-reduced products, other nutritional beverages, other applications that require greater control over protein, lactose, and total solids. But the other key part of that is the cheese, as that's an important outlet for UF. As those butterfat levels in the farm milk continue to rise, high protein UF can help rebalance that cheese vat and improve yields. The challenge is that cheesemakers are competing with higher value protein beverage and yogurt for that same UF supply. More UF capacity is expected to come online though here later this year and into 27. But that does not necessarily mean that the market will become oversupplied. I think the key question is whether capacity grows faster than the demand. The category obviously remains strong, although that increased competition from a wider retail perspective and potential consolidation could eventually slow growth. But so far, that demand has continued to outperform expectations. That strong UF demand also tightens the broader skim market because obviously that milk is moving into UF and no longer available for condensed skim or non-fat. But overall, improving milk production should create more opportunities, particularly in the skim market. However, that strong demand has regional processing constraints and plant reliability all play key factors here long term.
So we're probably not going to be moving in a straight line here, right? As production responds, we're trying to anticipate how demand continues to grow. We definitely know it's in vogue. It seems structural, like that we would see more of these protein enhanced consumer products coming online that are using liquid protein, as well as the popularity in the whey products and some of the others. But over the course of the next 30, 60 days, how are you feeling like that balances out? I heard you mention that we don't really see a lot more UF coming on until maybe later in the year. In the meantime, if I'm mapping this out correctly, particularly in the eastern half of the country, we're already snug milk. We have a lot of capacity for cheese that has been filling. We got hit with some heat and we're trying to digest the impact on milk production, but we believe there's been some already in mid-July. And class 1's going to start to ramp up in August. And at the moment, it feels to me like we're going to be competing pretty heavily in all of these sectors for the available milk solids that are out there. And it's already snug before the class 1 starts to pull their share.
Yeah, it feels like a perfect storm here is everyone's competing for those solids in the back half of this year before that additional capacity comes online to meet some of that demand. And that competition's been playing out all summer, but I think it'll really heat up as we get into August and September and October and schools start ramping up and everything aligns there. So I think it'll be very interesting to see if any product sectors get shorted. On the protein beverage side, they have shelves to make sure they stock and keep that space of the big box stores as well. So I think they're going to try to get their milk, but you alluded to it, these investments on the cheese side, they're going to want to keep those plants full. So it's going to be interesting to watch.
June milk production was a little bit higher than maybe most expected, 2.3% for the country, if I read it right. But most of that heat impact has been in recent weeks, right? The recent 3 weeks. So since July, we're looking at a milk production number that's dated, but we're experiencing a milk production climate right now that seems to be a little bit tighter for a variety of reasons. But probably one of the bigger one is normal seasonal summertime heat, but maybe coming on a bit earlier than expected and a bit stronger than we're used to at this point in time. We've had more headwinds in July. Let's talk cream for a second. Butter is moving counter seasonally. Overall, the market still feels heavy, but normally this time of year, we wouldn't be moving in the direction that we are. So let's go with where everything starts. What's happening on the cream side of things?
Yeah, fat remains tight, which has been somewhat surprising given the amount of milk being separated for the high protein beverages and all the value added skim products that we just talked about. As those markets continue to grow, obviously that generates butterfat and that has to find a home. But based on that, I would have expected more cream to be available, but instead that market has continued to absorb it. Butter is currently trading in the 155 to 160 range, well below levels that we saw last year. And at those levels, cream is much easier for the manufacturers to use in ice cream, cultured dairy, cream cheese, and other class 2 applications. It reduces that risk as far as finished product and carrying less value. But part of that may be the manufacturers that, adding that fat back into formulations after pulling back when butter prices were much higher. Lower fat cost, obviously, as far as a taste and texture, can improve flavor and yield across the board for a range of products. Even with the stronger milk production and continued growth in farm level butterfat, I do not expect that the cream market is suddenly going to become long, particularly during these summer months and with the heat that's still on the horizon and pressure on both milk and volume and components. Over time, the additional milk and fat production should help bring the market back into better balance. But right now, it's been long. That processing capacity will remain just as important as the total volume that's being produced.
Is class 2 performance still very strong this year?
It is. Yeah, they're the ones that are soaking up the majority of that fat right now.
Do we have a sense for if we had to try to measure the whole category? And I realize there's a lot of products that go into that category. It's pretty difficult to paint the broad brush. But do we have a sense for, are people looking at current markets as an opportunity to build structural inventory, or are they just moving that much more at the shelf?
I don't have
Anybody
a good
have a
sense
thought?
for that one.
I don't either. It'd be curious. Because if our class 2 performance, we've seen just domestic performance in certain products look really well year to date. Like the amount of non-fat that's been consumed domestically, class 2 numbers suggest that things are going really well in those markets. I'm just curious if consumer demand is up that much for some of these because maybe pricing, promotions, or other things, or if there's been some structural stock building in anticipation of needs the rest of the year. Let's move on. Let's talk about cheese a bit. Cheese just made a pretty decent move higher in Europe. Similar things. Mozzarella prices have really started to move higher in Europe. And now all of a sudden, with the US moving higher and European cheddar quite a bit lower than the bounce they saw on their mozzarella, we're not maybe in quite as an advantageous price position internationally as we were before. How do we see that playing out?
You just wonder what the real effect is going to be for a month or two when we see what happens and how much cheese is out there. But there is cheese available. If you wanted extra loads, they are there. We're pretty heavy in cheese. The only thing that we don't have a lot of right now is mozzarella. A lot of that had to do with the World Cup. And there's some plants that shut down for maintenance. Like Jared said, it was kind of like the perfect storm. Plants shut down. People were eating a lot of pizza because of the World Cup, a lot of house parties and stuff like that. But in about another month, we'll be out of this and there will be plenty of mozzarella available.
Our prices a lot higher right now than compared to Europe, especially in the Middle East and even in Asia still. So many people delayed what they would have normally ordered in Q2 and going into Q3 because of all of the uncertainty, the much higher fuel costs. Everybody has depleted their inventory, and despite our higher prices, we are still getting many requests now still from the Middle East. Pricing really isn't an issue. It's just how soon can you ship and how soon can you guarantee that it'll get here? So price does not seem to be the barrier right now. Everybody has used their inventory and they all need to restock. We have the supply. They're willing to pay a little more. Europe hasn't really been a conversation with any of our customers. They have not really tried to push back and say Europe is better priced right now. But yeah, the demand is definitely there right now, despite the jump in our market recently.
Interesting. So it feels like the international demand's there, the customers destocked, but at least for products other than mozzarella, we feel really heavy domestically. Is that still accurate?
Yeah. Yeah. But we are seeing the demand in the Middle East is not just for mozzarella right now. It is more geared towards cheddar. We are getting more inquiries for cheddar than mozzarella right now, which is good for us, both white and colors.
Obvious barriers there or risk can be tied around the current situation in Iran as well.
The Red Sea seems to be an issue now as well.
Yeah, Josh, you're dealing with updated issues. If the Houthis are getting involved, when you're looking at Yemen, that's a direct effect on the Red Sea, which is the other half of that peninsula. And then it starts to limit the only access point that you can have into the Red Sea being through the Suez Canal. So it can create a major supply chain choke point for just anybody trying to get any kind of imports into the region.
Including Europe, right?
Yeah, because that tends to be a route that can cut down on transit times. So you can run into situations where you might have to go around the Cape of Good Hope to get where you need to get. So it can cause a lot of complications across the board.
So you got an international market that does demand product. They're not well covered, but we're constantly fighting our ability to access and supply that demand. Same story 2 months later.
Yeah, and freight has doubled, and that does not seem to be a barrier.
Nope.
Demand seems resilient then, huh?
Yeah, so I guess, Josh, not being too familiar on the dairy side, still learning a lot. I would imagine that means the price difference there is significant enough where historically logistics has been a major barrier for U.S. product getting international. I think that clearly the opportunities continue to make themselves clearer for international growth with U.S. dairy product.
If we could wave a wand and the conflict was over tomorrow, which is not likely, I understand that. Do we think that customers are going to step in heavily and demand's going to feel strong at that moment because they're not getting an adequate amount of product, or have they been purchasing to be safe all along and trying to stay ahead of their needs?
I think they've been trying to wait it out, and they keep thinking, oh, okay, it's the war's over, and it keeps restarting. I don't think they have any inventory now. They want to know how fast can you get it here and how much.
Specifically as it relates to the Iran conflict, where are we at in terms of demand destruction? Because when we started these conversations, and I think we had Safitra on a call probably almost 2 months ago now, and we asked the question, how long does this have to go on before it goes into notable demand destruction within the region because people can't import the raw materials they need to make the products that they consume? If price isn't really the barrier at the moment, it still is access to the supply. I think at that point in time, we talked about August sort of being like the magic month, to where if this lasts into August, we're going to start to really hurt dairy consumption within the region.
I think that's still the magical question we're trying to find the answer to.
The war is prolonging the situation. It could have happened by now, but that huge variable is not really giving us a good read.
Do we think the answer is going to be universally the same between milk powders, butterfat, and cheese, or is it different for different products?
The answer is the same because it's availability. They're all on the same boats, right? You don't ship cheese separately from powders, separately from butter. I think it's all just access based.
I'll clarify the question. It's less about the ability to get the product and more about at what point in the timeline when you can't get it conveniently, do you start to have demand destruction on the consumer level? Because you can't get the cheese, which you will find its way to retail, the butterfat, which is largely an ingredient for processed cheese applications and other things, the milk powders, which serve some of the same and some different manufacturing products. All three of them overlap each other like a chain, but the cheese is closest to consumer. The butterfat is very close to consumer as an ingredient making some of these processed cheese products and other things. Milk powders going into some of that, but then also as an ingredient, maybe in other applications like bakery and some consumer packaged goods. If we get into August, which of those areas is most vulnerable? Is it the consumer products? Because they really are bringing it in just in time. They have to make what they make. They're considered more luxury type items that you can cut from your diet if you can't get it. versus maybe something along the lines of manufactured products that they may have more deep inventories of, and they will run out, but they might not be running out until September or beyond. At this moment, I don't get the impression, talking to European colleagues, talking within our own team in the different product categories, it doesn't feel like material demand destruction yet. It seems like we're still finding a way to get some product in. Seems like they're still willing to pay for product. Seems like some stuff's still happening. It's just at some moment that will come to a head, I think. And we initially expected by August it would become a real problem that meant we're going to be missing dairy demand out of that region. I mean, we're knocking on the door of August. We'll be right back after these messages.
I'm Diego Carvalho with TC Jacoby and Company. TC Jacoby and Company specializes in international dairy markets. For new customers that haven't done business with Jacoby, I would tell them that we can provide them with many of the powders, dairy products that they consume, not only with the physical product, but we can also help them mitigate their risk. We know dairy, we know the main players, we know the main providers for the whole value chain. We are one of the strongest players in the US market because we have contact all the way from the farmer, moving the liquid milk all the way to the end users that buy the end products. I am Diego Carvalho with TC Jacoby and Company, and we bring dairy to the world.
Let's shift gears. Diego, let's talk a bit about non-fat dry milk, skim milk powder, and what's happening globally there. Yesterday, we had a firm GDT. What does that tell you?
We've seen the market under heavy pressure, mainly in the US, which was the market that was the most expensive for the past, I would say, 6 months. It seems like the US market is going back into a price range where we're competitive internationally. And that had to happen because the US, as we mentioned before, we need to export about 2 out of 3 loads that we manufacture in the US for non-fat. And we were not competitive for a long period of time. Our prices were $400 to even $1,000 per metric ton higher than European prices. And now that we finally have plenty of availability, we have to find a price where exports become competitive again. And that's what's happened. In the past few weeks, we've had a few additional factors that have added pressure to prices. And that's what Jared mentioned on plant interruptions in the US. And that's definitely shifted some skim milk concentrate and some products to the drying towers. And that's adding a lot of pressure onto prices. We're seeing more inventory, more product availability from the manufacturers, and the market is looking for other outlets. And those outlets are in the Middle East, in Asia, and other places, maybe South America, where the cost of the freight has gone up to an extent where we're paying probably twice what we used to pay. So the ex-works price has to come down so that we're competitive again. We should find some support in the current levels. We're close to the 140s, and the physical offers are even lower than that, especially for S&P. For S&P, we're seeing offers close to the 135, which is 10 cents under the current futures. And I think at that level, we're starting to be competitive even with a more expensive freight rate. I think we should find support unless we start seeing Europe trend lower and New Zealand prices also trending lower, which hasn't happened at this point. A lot of availability around and not too many customers looking for product at this moment.
Okay, on the whey product side, it is absolutely the definition of a summer market right now. I think after 2 quarters of prices constantly moving up for whey proteins and the whey market trying to rebalance so many changes over the past year, over the course of 2025 and into early 2026, we saw a lot of large sweet whey powder producers upgrade their facilities to higher protein WPC 80 or WPI. At the same time, there was the commissioning of a very large sweet whey powder facility in Texas that is offsetting the production that we've lost. And that's been a bit turbulent. And that just means that we're exchanging approved brands for both domestic customers and international customers for a new brand that needs to be approved. And so we've seen a trading range for sweet whey powder that's been 60 to 70 cents for quite a while. But the actual spot market has seen a lot more basis volatility. New brands trying to buy their way into business, brands that remain that have legacy or approvals for perhaps Asian clientele in a market that seems to be pretty short right now, they're getting bigger basis premiums. So sweet whey powder has been largely range bound, but that doesn't really tell the story. It's been a big shift in who has the product and where that product can go. On the protein side, that story is pretty well documented and well reported at the moment. It is shockingly resilient. Diego mentioned that milk proteins are realizing the benefits of this health and wellness movement. Some of the current trade relationships might be supportive of milk proteins. Aside from that, we're just seeing more demand, people formulating to it, buying more and using more of it. Jared talked about the UF side of things and how there's just new demand creation in a lot of different categories, from beverage to some of the other class 2 products. The whey category remains just on fire. Seems to be both products. Now, we had 2 quarters in a row where people were terrified they couldn't get access to supply, and they watched pricing increase by 20+%. Now we get into the summer and pricing hasn't increased over the last few weeks, and that's making some people nervous. But you've got a lot of people out there that are like, oh, it's not going to continuously go up. Does that mean this market's going to crash? It's always possible, of course. These markets don't move one directionally. We should expect a retracement at some moment in time. But everything I read from the consumer demand aspect of it, I don't see any cracks in the floor. What I see is we've moved pricing up so rapidly that now that people are going into the summer months and maybe taking some holidays, if they come back in August and need to replenish, this thing goes right back up. If they come into August and find out that the movements on the shelf at the grocery stores have slowed, as much of a price increase we've seen, we should look out. So I'm not in either camp right now. I guess I'm a little bit more the belief that the consumer profile seems to be growing, seems to be willing to pay the prices that we've seen. And every time we start to think that the GLP-1 catalyst will end or mature, the GLP-1 drug gets cheaper. You can take it in a different form, and a larger percentage of Americans are actively using the drug. I'm also starting to see the GLP-1 aspect of the protein market get reported in Europe more. We have to remember the US market is nowhere near mature, and in terms of its adoption of GLP-1 as a weight loss tool, consumers are educating themselves at a rapid level, trying to understand what the right foods are, and dairy seems to be on the right side of that discussion. Whey protein maybe being the biggest beneficiary, milk proteins, though, certainly a beneficiary, and the rest of the world still can follow. So I don't know. I remain pretty bullish protein overall, but I think it would be irresponsible to assume that this is a one-directional market and that it's just going to resume an uptrend as we get past the summer slowdown that we're experiencing in North America and Europe. We need to be aware of what some of the potential upside shocks could be to the market as the globe enters those months where we produce the least amount of milk. We should keep our eye on a few potential shocks, not all to the upside, some to the downside, but I think we're vulnerable to see maybe a little bit of volatility in the months to come. Let's go through the group as sort of kind of a fun round the table. Most important discussion or impactful thing in the past week that has your attention. So Tristan, let's start with you.
One of the most notable developments is the continued shift towards milk proteins. As WPC 80 and WPI prices remain expensive and a little bit more difficult to source, I've noticed more people are evaluating MPCs as a partial replacement, which is creating stronger demand across the entire high proteins category.
Kate, how about you?
There does seem to be a lot of demand for whey permeate and lactose abroad that you just don't see in the US, so I find that kind of interesting.
Good point. We didn't touch on that, but it started with lactose, and now it's even cascaded to whey permeate. The amount of inquiries that we've received in the past couple weeks across all sectors, international feed sectors, international food sectors, domestic food, and domestic feed. It's clearly a tight market. Great point. Thank you. Miguel?
It might be just isolated to Mexico, but there's a lot of cheese in Mexico. When we were in the 140s, probably a lot of cheese made its way down there, and it has affected the market right now. With the prices now, the hope of the customers that we talk to is that things will level off. But right now, still a lot of cheese, a lot of cheap cheese in Mexico. It affects current business right now. And the second one is demand during World Cup is not as good as expected. And this comes from the Association of Supermarkets and Convenience Stores in Mexico. So 2 things that really caught my eye in the last 2 weeks.
How do we feel the same question would be answered in the US? Do we think that the World Cup impact on demand was worse than, equal to, or better than expected?
I think it was better than expected because when this first came out, I didn't think that it would impact a whole lot. But when it was all said and done, it just seems like the snack part of the cheese business really took off along with pizzas. I think there were a lot of pizzas consumed. That's why mozzarella is really tight. It probably will be for at least another month or so.
Jonathan.
Yeah, I think probably the most impactful thing is talking about WPC 34 and nonfat. Nonfat and S&P hasn't been readily available in the Midwest, and there's a need for that protein range in the calf milk replacer world, and we're starting to get a lot more conversations around stockpiles for those products. As we've discussed, WPC 34 is kind of a dying product. There's not a lot of people that are making it anymore, and there seems to be a lot of companies, even in the food space, that are still very reliant on it and trying to satisfy the need for it when it isn't necessarily available. We've had people reach out for permeating lactose. The volume of requests has been astonishing, honestly.
Well,
where I have a lot of my focus is cheese in general. It just feels like there is something brewing right now. Technically, it's entered an uptrend right now again, and it's still choppy, right? At least on the futures board, but it feels like there's opportunities there. And yeah, so I'm just soaking up everything I can hear about cheese right now and really try to get a feeling for the market there. Besides that, non-fat is just shaving off more and more. We basically broke the support we had for a long time now. So it really feels like it's on another leg down. Yeah, we're going to see how that plays out. I personally also think we're going to find support in the 140s, that we might test a little lower than that. But at some point, it should stall and become a little more stable.
Diego, based on what you said about S&P in the 130s, and then what Manuel just said about the technical support and what that looks like, that kind of aligns, right? Because I think I heard you make the comment that a 140 non-fat, you can make S&P cheaper. For those that don't really pay attention to the difference, lactose is really tight too. Do we think that there's a connection to why the milk sugars are tight and all of a sudden we are seeing pricing that's a little bit more S&P competitive globally?
I do think that there is, yeah. We made very little S&P for the first 6 months of the year because it wouldn't make any sense to export when we're $1,000 higher than European markets. Now that we're competitive, it does make a lot of sense to make S&P, especially when protein is very high and you can take it down with a cheap product like lactose or milk permeate. It makes sense to find demand in other markets for that S&P. So I do think that the demand for the carbohydrates has picked up now that non-fat has become competitive again.
For the benefit of everyone, so we're all talking the same language, non-fat dry milk and S&P are typically universally used in applications, but they're very different products. What we call non-fat dry milk is an unstandardized product. That specification is a minimum protein percent of 34. But today's productivity of components in our milk supply, the average unstandardized protein level in non-fat dry milk is pushing 38 or more percent, at least 37.5 in most times. Now, the rest of the world standardizes their product, and they standardize either one of two things: 32%, which is the old codex, 34%, which I think is a little bit more common, or at least is common out of the US that we would standardize the 34%. When we say, why would there be a connection between lactose and milk powder? You can add lactose or milk permeate to your non-fat supply to bring the protein down to a standard level. So when we stay standardized, that's what we mean, where they're basically bringing it to a 34% protein, most commonly out of the US. And then that allows us to compete for international business. Certain markets can use either, but certainly would prefer a higher protein content at a competitive price. So when I mentioned our futures are at 140, that's non-fat. And our average non-fat has a higher protein. So if we're standardizing, that means that we can add this cheaper lactose or cheaper milk permeate to the volume, and that lowers the overall price. So the whole conversation there was more or less like, hey, are we making SMP now? And are we competing globally for international business? Because if we are, that also tells us at least we're closer to finding a support price, finding some type of global support level for the product. But you'll hear us really start to break down the difference between SMP, non-fat dry milk. But many customers can use either. I wouldn't say most, but many. Okay. All right, we covered a lot. Yara, any discussions over the past week that you feel were most interesting?
It's a lot of inventory in Mexico, and the customer was offering me non-fat dry milk instead of buying. That was the most surprise. We know that since the price is going down so bad and they have a lot of inventory with high prices, they have a contract that they have to take it. That's hard for them. They are losing a lot of money. And the inquirers, they looking for whey permeate, they're looking for lactose and proteins. But it's hard to get the whey permeate and the lactose, like you mentioned it. But this is the inquiry we have in Mexico so far, just protein, basically, because otherwise it's difficult right now.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, all, I know it was an unusual discussion. Thanks for joining us today on the Milk Check.
We welcome your participation in the Milk Check. If you have comments to share or questions you want answered, send an email to podcast@jacoby.com. Our theme music is composed and performed by Phil Hagee. The Milk Check is a production of TC Jacoby and Company.
For one part of the supply chain to be successful, everyone has to be. My superpower is practical application of data and analysis. I believe firmly that Jacoby's success is because we help our suppliers and our buyers be successful. I'm Mike Brown, and I love working for TC Jacoby and Company because I get to help people make their businesses more successful.